to theater artists from New York, from the US and around the world to hear what's on their mind, what they are thinking, how they experience this unprecedented moment where we are all inside a catastrophe movie. It's a creational myth with a mad king and the plague in the country, people out of jobs, people not having enough to eat. And what's going to happen and what decisions are we going to make? We as people, for ourselves, as theater makers, and also as members of the society. And artists always, we feel, have answers. They have always been on the right side of social justice, on the right side of the complex struggle for liberties and for freedom. And we have to listen to them always, but perhaps never was a more important time to listen to artists and not just to the politicians, to the virologists, economists. What theater people, theater artists have to say is of essence, it's of importance of what life is all about. And we should listen very, very careful. As we all know, the signs around us are not good. There's a resurgence of the virus. Florida, Texas, California, all the numbers are up again. The summer did not bring any relief, and no therapy or no vaccination is in sight. So we are in a place of uncertainty and our lives are in danger. The wrong handshake could kill us, or even getting the COVID, as we know, we might get serious lung damage, heart damage. We don't know what long-term effects are. So there has never been in my lifetimes and in many lifetimes such a complicated, serious and dangerous situation. All theaters are closed still in the US, the big ones, but there are initiatives outside the big cities, and we will hear a bit about it today. And of course, theater artists have been hit hard, as all artists, musicians, out of jobs, out of gigs. And it's a disastrous time, so we need to support artists. We have to be there for them. But we also need to listen to them, what they have to say, because they are not just victims, they are also of this, they are intelligent human beings who perhaps perceive the present much stronger than we do. They anticipate the future. So much of their work has been dealing with environmental problems, problems in our society, in politics, and we should have listened to them. This is not just a story for a play, entertainment, it really has a meaning behind it. And now it becomes clear that we have to understand that better. Yesterday we had Jacques Rancière, the great French philosopher, and I'm not sure if I completely did him justice, but his idea of radical equality of intelligence, of listening to each other, to find ways to share the space at the table, disenfranchised members who are demanding to be part of society, how significant it is, and actually that they also don't need our help or salvation. All we have to do is listen, and also they will come up with their own answers, as the Black Lives Matter movement, so many others are doing now. With us today, we have a member of the New York theater community who we think of as, how would one say, like a Statue of Liberty, is like a landmark. And it's the great Morgan Jenness, who has been, since her early work in life with the theater, with the New York theater, starting with the public and going back to Joe Papp. She is an educator, an activist. She worked in a literary office as an associate producer at the public, and New York Theater Workshop and LATC. There was she an associate artistic director, and she is overall a dramaturg, as someone who defines her work bigger or in a different context than just the show itself, the production itself. Say, what are the connections? What are the social impact? What are the historical impacts? Why do we do this show? For whom? What is it good for? She has been a creative consultant at many agencies, Abrams and Helen, Merrill. She has helped so many young artists when they started out. The Taylor Macks or George Foxes of the world, and many others when they were not where they were now. It was Morgan who was there for them. And everybody in the theater respects her, loves her, and her concerns are also our concerns. And she got an Obie for long-term support of Playwrights. She has the LMDA Lessing Award after Gottfried Ephraim Lessing, the significant, maybe first dramaturg on planet Earth. And now she also works with Double Edge Theater as a creative consultant and is involved in LaMama and in a project she calls In This Distant Globe.
Distracted
globe, and so it is something you will talk to us about. So as I always say, I say it's all about listening, and then I talk and talk and talk. Forgive me. Morgan, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you with us. It's perhaps the last week of these kind of talks. After 4 months, we take a little break and rethink. So it's an important moment. Where are you?
I am up at Double Edge in the artistic director's home, Stacy Klein's home. I have been here working on this project, which is called, I'm going to talk about it more later, 6 Feet Apart All Together, which is live theater. And what's interesting about being here is that Double Edge has been very much about social justice, community, art, and the intersections between all of that. In terms of the work they do here on the farm. They do a summer spectacle every year. The work that they've done in other theaters, touring around. They had a tour just interrupted by COVID of Leonore and Alejandro, about Leonore Carrington, the great surrealist artist who lived in Mexico after she fled Europe during the Second World War. So that was interrupted, and it was kind of the idea of, yes, what do we do when things shut down? And I think what I love about them and some of the other people that I've worked with and we'll talk about is that they tend to put the word how in front of a phrase, right? So can we do it? It's not so much can we do it, but how can we do it? And also, what is it that we are doing? Very much what you talked about. Like, I'm glad you talked about it because you really set up a lot of the things that I deeply believe in terms of dramaturgy. And I always like to say that I don't like nouns so much. I know Gertrude Stein talked about embracing the noun. I like to embrace the verb or the active sentence. So I like to say I've committed many acts of dramaturgy and haven't been arrested yet, though might happen in the future. So, and that whole thing, that the dramaturgical approach to everything is a dramaturgical approach. How do things work? Why do they work? Who do they work for? Right? All those questions that you ask of a play, you really ask in life and in the world, in politics and social structures. Like right now, we're in the biggest piece of theater. You know, I always quibbled with Susan Sontag a little bit when she was talking, you know, against illness being a metaphor, that it wasn't a metaphor. And I do think that, and I understand why she said that, because it was a time where people were being blamed kind of for their own cancer, you know, that somehow it was some sort of psychological detriment on their part that made them ill. And I agree with her that that's very dangerous territory. But when you talk about a plague, which actually is not necessarily, the original term doesn't necessarily mean an illness, it means an attack. It means an attack of some kind. So if you talk about a plague and what's being revealed in that plague and the revelation of that, which is an apocalypse. An apocalypse is a revelation. Apocalypse is an uncovering. Scholars say that it comes from Ulysses when he tore off Calypso's road. He apocalypsed himself and freed himself and was able to swim up to the surface. But the whole idea of the revelation that any apocalypse brings is really interesting to me, because I think what's happening now is that we are being revealed to ourselves in very deep ways. And I have to say first that we're very lucky. We're sitting here, we're on Zoom, we're talking about, you know, esoteric, you know, aesthetics and, you know, ethics to a certain point, but there's so many people who are in dire straits and who will be in dire straits. What's going to happen in fall with people who are jobless, people who might be evicted, people who are ill or families are ill, whole communities that are so vulnerable. But also those communities, many of them have already been incredibly vulnerable. So I think in a way that this time reminds me of two lines. One of them, which I think is really reflective of our time, which is from George C. Wolfe's A Colored Museum, which I had the great pleasure and honor to work with, where it starts out with Miss Pat, who's a stewardess flying a plane, celebrity slave ship, the plane over history. And she's pointing to various aspects of history. And at one point she flies over the Great Depression and she says, oh, there's the Great Depression. Now everyone gets to live the way we've been living. So the whole thing of what we are being affected by in our kind of middle-class Western world going, oi, 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 right? Many, many people have been living with for a long time. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, like you said, but a lot of people say, you know, you seem really like optimistic or happy. And it's like, no, I'm never optimistic. I'm an incredible pessimist. But one thing is I may be optimistically defiant. What Tony calls a pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, which he says he stole from some German philosopher, but I bet he said it much more succinctly. And the other thing, but the other line that always stays with me is Larry Kramer, who I also had the great pleasure to work with several times, in his play, The Normal Heart, where basically Ned Weeks says, and this was very much the way Larry felt, and I think in some ways it's what bonded Larry and I to each other, because I felt very similarly because of various things in my past and just the way I grew up in the world, where he says, everybody's walking around as if we're at peace. And I'm the only one who seems to know we're at war, right? So the whole idea is that this is history. This is human history. These little windows that we have where we're all in a bubble and comfortable and feel safe and whatever, I always feel they're false. And when they happen, I don't trust them. And when something like this happens, I somewhat go, oh yes, there is the world. There it is. That's people. And now, what are we going to do about it? And how can we do things within it and about it? And how can we tango with it and maybe not always get dipped and dropped? And how do we work with the tides of history? Like I once said to Larry when he was going to address a crowd, it was a very, very moving moment, that he felt, how am I going to give this crowd any kind of hope? It was bad. And I said, well, you know, we always think that we have to have progress. We have to move forward. We have to move forward. But sometimes the greatest triumph you can have is not being completely swept away. And that's about holding ground. And holding ground, you can hold ground so much better if you hold ground in a community. And that's why the whole thing with theater, why I love being here at this point, because it really is regrounding and understanding that theater has always been, in one way or another, even the most commercial Broadway show has been about being at the center of a community, being the nucleus that people want to come around and orbit around, or be comets and just, you know, kind of pay a little visit for a second, or, you know, bye. So the whole idea of theater being the locus point of a community, being the center, it's, you know, the universal laws of the universe and of physics, the nucleus, the center of gravity, the soul of the sun, the solar system. So I think, and I think I'm still very romantic about the theater. I do go back to not only Greek, but a lot of indigenous cultures, which saw the theater still very much connected to a performance of community, a performance of, just pulling in that Greek word again, though it comes up in so many cultures, the idea of entheos asmos, that you bring the deity down. It's not prayers going up, right? My prayers go up, right? It's the idea of bringing the deity, the spirits down so that you're possessed by them. And you see rituals that actually do this in Haiti and other, you know, places in Africa where you are possessed, not only the shamanistic center, but the community that is participating in the ritual are possessed by the deity, by the spirit. And one of my favorite sort of translations is that entheos asmos is really the root of enthusiasm. Right? So you don't say, I'm enthusiastic about something, but you're enthusiastic in a much deeper way. It's just like, oh, this makes me excited. It's like, oh, I'm strengthened, I'm fulfilled. I can stand in the place where I am and feel pride and power within that. And then I can open up to the community, and the community will share in that. So that all the ancient roots of theater for me still apply, no matter what the form is. Even Zoom, I've seen Zoom experiences where I kind of go, whoa, this actually is not just people saying, oh, well, we can't do something, so we're just going to do a reading with our heads, which is fine, because that also makes communities. A lot of theaters that can't be live will do Zoom performances or Zoom. What you've been doing is a community. That is like more than anything, I think, is no matter who talks or what they talk about, it is creating and enlarging this nucleus of ideas and thoughts that has a gravitational pull, and that can also, have an impact on the people who listen, on what people think about. And the more we think about, the more we feel, and the more we see, again, going back to original words, theater, theatron, meant the seeing place. And as Zelda Fitchhandler said and reminded all of us when the new arena stage opened up some years ago, the seeing place does not only mean what you are looking at, but how it is reflecting into seeing back into yourself as an individual and as a community, as a society. Whether you're talking about the Athens, should we really have a court system, which is what the Oresteia really is about, or whatever it is that we're seeing back into ourselves. So I think the form, like a lot of people are going, oh my God, Zoom and all this. I said, no, that's a form. And some people have done amazing things with Zoom. I mean, I think Richard Nelson, when he's done these new plays with the Apple family, those are two of my favorite plays, because they absolutely live in the situation that they're in, which all those plays did. They were written to open on elections. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Richard was writing them up to the very first performance. But these last ones, which incorporates COVID, which incorporates Zoom, which is absolutely present in the context in which in some ways, I think they're my favorites, because they're so immediate. And also there's something very powerful of people looking directly at you, right? Breaking the fourth wall. We have like space and time and glass and everything in between us, but we're looking at each other. And like, I taught a lot of classes from spring and summer, on Zoom. But, I would have a student in China who would get up at 6 a.m. to come to the 7 o'clock evening class, and people were coming from all over the country and all over the world and joining. And you see these readings, which I love, where they put the actors' names and then they say where they're located. And all of a sudden, time and space is just collapsed. So there's something interesting in that in terms of what we learned from this time about ourselves, about a society, about that word that's been thrown around so much, what is essential, the essential workers, which are often the most vulnerable workers and the least cared for workers in the society otherwise, right? So what is essential, I think, is so fascinating to look at right now. But I think going back to that central idea that it is about reflecting to a community and giving a community a locus point around which they can gather. And if they can gather around it in some way physically still, that becomes really, really exciting. So that's, So that's why I'm happy to be here.
Well, really, thank you. Thank you for being with us and for sharing. That is also of significance of what you say. Where were you when it started? When did you become aware of the corona?
I was in New York City. And actually, interestingly enough, I went to one of the last live performances in New York City before everything got shut down, which was the audience sitting in a ball pit at Taylor Mack's The Fray not only were we like, somewhat near, even though we were they tried to or we were already trying to distance the audience. It was I think it was actually the last show that performed. And the plastic balls were disinfected. So they were probably even cleaner than the seats were. But that's where I was. I was in New York City. Yeah. I was in New York City and teaching, and I'd go to the Foundry office, Melanie's office, to teach because she had better Wi-Fi than I did at home. And I also just liked walking, like just getting out, like felt very daring and very revolutionary to get out and be masked and avoid everybody, but walk 5 blocks to the Foundry office, So I thought, well, that's essential. I have to go to the store and I have to, do those things, and I have to go teach. That is essential.
And then you stayed in your apartment for months, a couple of weeks?
Yeah. So I mainly, for months. Well, I didn't, because I started joining the demonstrations that happened.
So you went out and demonstrated after?
Yeah, I didn't go to as many as I wanted to because I was a little worried. I had a cough, which ended up being like bronchial and I got tested. So, I didn't really go out much until, I was fairly sure that I was okay. I'd also been exposed to see friends who had lost a family member. And I sort of said, I don't care, you're in grief, and I'm going to hug you and hold you with my mask on and facing away. But, if the deities want to kill me because I'm feeling compassion for people in great loss, well, then go ahead and do that. And then if you exist when I die, I'm going to come up and smack you around. So, but that's, goes back to defiance. When people say, do you have optimism? Do you have hope? And I said, no, not really. But I have a lot of defiance.
So you put your life at risk to go to the demonstrations.
Yeah. Though the demonstrators, I have to say, most of the demonstrators were masked. Who was not masked was the police. And there's this great streamer that I love called O Robin, who has some amazing videos. I would watch when I couldn't go out. I would watch his live streams, and he just somehow got incredible footage of a lot of the demonstrations. And what he was starting to do, which was really funny, he'd go up to the police and go, "Put your mask on. Why aren't you wearing your mask? Put your mask on. Put your mask on." And it's it's like they're saying, in New York State, this is the law, and here's the supposedly, the people enforcing the law, breaking the law, and in other ways.
Yeah.
So,
It did not help.
But that was theater. That was a theatrical event. And it was a theatrical event in the Boal way of spect actors, right? Because everyone who was there was participating as a spect actor. They were participating in the play of defiance, and in the play of calling out, and in the play of putting a spotlight on another virus, another kind of plague within the society. And I think that's the whole thing. It's like, what are all these other plagues? It's so interesting. Now everyone's talking about Shakespeare and also the Greeks, and Camus suddenly is really popular. And you think about Artaud, and theater as the plague, and how much that, seems to resonate, and like Naomi Wallace's One Flea Spared is, being revived. It's interesting in terms of, looking at this, but looking at it, not literally, but again, sorry, Susan Sontag, as a metaphor.
Yeah,
as a metaphor.
Something real. Yeah, I think Roncière yesterday talked about the 68 demonstrations in France, where leading Marxist theories would say they have no leader, can be supported, and he said presence changed. The politics, and the theory comes later.
Yes.
And he said people went out there and they had showed presence, and they said, like artists, people on the street are imagining a better life. They want to have a new perspective. They think what they see does not work. And they demand to be, you know, at the table. They demand a fair share. They demand living conditions, that access to education, health, and the arts, of course, as we think that it is actually the present that does those things that really change. And it means something might already have changed because they come in your lifetime of working for the theater. In this very moment, what do you think? What do you think of theater?
Well, it's interesting because I'd already started to have a lot of thoughts about theater, and what I saw was a kind of habit of theater and show business theater and the marketplace of theater and the why do we do theater. I felt people didn't know why they were doing theater. They were doing theater out of habit. They were doing theater out of ego. They were doing theater for a lot of reasons that I was kind of thinking, I don't know, theater is not so interesting to me anymore. I was so immersed and excited about the theater when I first came to New York in the mid-70s. And then I was lucky enough to fall into, like I always say, I'm a little kitchen dog in my career. And a kitchen dog is you open up the back door to take out the trash and you leave the door ajar and you come in and there's a little stray dog in your kitchen and it kind of looks like Benji and it needs a bath and it's hungry and it wags its tail and licks your hand and you say, oh, cute little dog, come on in the house. And 10 years later, you can't get it out of your best chair, right? And it's just part of the family. So I've been very lucky in terms of the doors that happen to be open that I snuck into. So the public theater,
When was that moment? When did you snuck in? What happened? That moment?
With the public theater?
Or in general, when you came to the theater, you said, how you got into the door. What was that moment?
Well, a couple of things. When I was about 8 years old, I went to see Shakespeare at live Shakespeare at the Sylvan Theater outdoors in Washington, D.C. The Sylvan Theater was at the base of the Washington Monument. And the woman who started it, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't remember her name, had actually been inspired by Joe Papp and had been advised by Joe Papp into how to make a summer outdoor theater for Shakespeare. So it was wonderful. And we saw Midsummer Night's Dream, which I thought was fabulous. And they had Puck climb the fir tree at the end with the spotlight on it. And it was just magical. And Shakespeare and language, and just, I was entranced with theater. And there's a funny story that the next year they did A Winter's Tale, which made me really mad. I hissed to my parents, why are there so many shepherds? And I didn't like the clown and I just wanted to get back to the story. And then I got really mad about the ending. And I said, what, Hermione? She wasn't a statue. She was like, where was she for 16 years? Knitting? And I tried to talk about that to my parents. And I remember leaning back in the backseat of the car thinking, they can't have this discussion with me, like baby dramaturg, right? They can't have this discussion with me. They can't be my parents. It turned out they weren't really my parents, which was really odd. But then years later, Bill Kane, the great Bill Kane, the writer and Jesuit priest who had started the Boston Shakespeare Festival, I told him this story and he just laughed. And he said, no, he said, when Hermione got all this horrible news, her husband and the loss of her children and just everything, the world turning upside down, she literally went into a catatonic state. And Paulina for 16 years every morning takes her out of bed and feeds her and puts her in the chair where she looks out at the countryside, and tries to talk to her, but she's basically been catatonic. And then when she hears her husband and she hears her daughter, she comes out of that state. And I said, where were you when I was 9? So Shakespeare was one of my first loves. That's the whole thing, falling into the public theater and Joe Papp and the love of Shakespeare. In fact, in this Distracted Globe is from a Hamlet quote, where he says, alas, poor, memory, alas, poor ghost, remember, yes, while memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, in which it's a pun about the theater, but it's also his mind and it's also the world, right? So it's just that whole thing about this distracted globe. So that's kind of the name of my consultancy, which I came up with over 10 years ago, but seems more appropriate than ever in terms of how do you find the center of gravity in the distracted globe, right? How do you re-gravitate to the core that keeps the planet from spinning out? And it's very much in terms of the way I approach dramaturgy is what is at the core. Like in terms of the Aristotelian elements, I always felt for me that the why of something was the most important. Why? Why are you doing this? Why is it being done? And to go back to your question about the theater, I wasn't seeing the why so much. The why was, oh yes, we want audiences to come in. We want people to buy tickets. It's something that I remember being at a panel with Anna DeVere Smith, where she talked about the difference between consumers and citizens. And we talked about, yeah, that's very much in terms of like the difference between ticket buyers and audience and what it means, you know, to be that audience that's listening, that's in the seeing place, that's seeing into them. You know, why do people go to the theater? Why do people do theater? What is the meaning of the theater? And that wasn't a new question for me. I was already having that question, but in a way, the world sort of made that question even more intense. And so like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? And how can we do it? Is, I think, the question for everyone. I mean, I think survival is going to be a bigger and bigger issue, just survival. And I think then Josh Fox, who I work with, who did the documentary on fracking, the gas land cycle, has been working on a piece called "The Truth Has Changed," which looked at the whole thing about the truth, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and a lot of it, you know, it just swirled out from there. But one of, you know, the questions he asked in the piece is like, we have to think about, you know, not getting the gun, but the, you know, the spare bedroom. Who do we put in the spare bedroom? How do we expand our community? You know, how do we open up our lives and our hearts to people that it's just going to get worse? We've seen the beginning of climate change refugees. I mean, Syria, the whole thing in Syria really was climate change because of the drought for 2 years and the farmers begging for some sort of redress. So how do we function with our communities, even if it's a small community? You know, how do we function inside that? What are our ethics? And then how are our ethics revealed in the aesthetics? And that's the thing about theater. When I first came to New York in the mid-70s, first I was interested in musicals. That was the other thing that I got into at an early age, musicals. For a while I was a singer, then I had kind of physical issues that I couldn't really sing. I've started singing again a little bit, which is really exciting for me because I haven't really been singing for a long time. So I loved musicals. And my father would go to business trips in New York and would bring back the cast album for musicals, including things like Subways Are for Sleeping. I don't know if anyone remembers that musical, but I used to sing that song where they get up, get cross over, get down. You know, they had a whole Subway song. I don't even remember the plot, but I remember that song. Kiss Me, Kate, Camelot. I mean, all these, you know, I grew up with the musicals. And then I performed like a lot of people did. I performed musicals in high school, things like that, and thought that that's what I would do. I thought I would be a musical theater performer, but that didn't pan out. But I wanted to have a life in the theater. I think partly because I felt the theater contained everything, all the arts, visual, lighting, costuming, you know, contained philosophy. Again, going back to the source of Shakespeare, you know, he stole all his plots or borrowed all his plots. Everybody borrowed plots at that time, right? It would be a disaster now. He wouldn't have a career. But you know, and he was a terrific poet, but there were other really great poets around. I always felt that Shakespeare's ability, whoever he was, and I do think he was the son of a working bourgeois, not really working
Lovemaker.
Huh? Glovemaker, yeah. That he didn't come from the aristocracy. He wasn't one of the Cambridge wits and like, oh, of course. And I always thought the proof that he really did exist was Robert Greene's invective, that called him that upstart crow, with the things he makes, the shake scene, and I always thought that the fact that the other writers were grumpy about him actually meant that he was who he said he was. Though I also think that he collaborated a lot more than people think. I think when it was really fascinating, this new edition of the Henrys, which say that he and Marlowe collaborated on the Henry VIs, which makes perfect sense. And his whole relationship, his rivalry or whatever their relationship was. He wrote 5 plays basically in response to Marlowe's plays, including Titus Andronicus, which I disagree with Harold Bloom. I think it was satire, and it works really well as a dark comedy, which is how Taylor Mack actually started his play, that turned into just saying, a sequel to Titus Andronicus, what happens at the end. And because he was going to do an adaptation, and then he felt, I don't want to have Lavinia's mutilated body on the stage. I don't want to put those women's bodies on the stage and continue to do that, which moved me a lot. He said, I think I'd rather do a sequel. And I said, oh, well, how does it start? He says, curtain risers, there's a pile of bodies on the stage, and the maid arrives with a mop to clean up. I said, wow, are you the maid? Yes, originally he was going to play. And I said, what's your name? And he said, Gary, which I thought was hysterical. So, yeah. But that whole idea of how things react to other things, and the philosophy at the core of Shakespeare for me, and at the core of most writers that I really love, is why. How do people navigate in the world they're in? How do people navigate in the lives they're in? How do people, and I say this to my students, and this you see in movements, like all the exciting movements that started with started again in some ways with the Black Arts movement and in the 60s and all that, where people said, no, we are going to take the pen that writes our narrative, very Luddite. We're going to take the pen that writes our narrative into our own hands. We're going to control that narrative as much as possible, as much as you can control a narrative in life, right? Which is like anything could happen at any time. Truck could speed around this curve, and smash into me as I'm walking down to the theater, which they're always nervous about. So anything could happen at any time, right? And the whole idea of like having at least control of the pen in your hand that can write your narrative, or the brush that's able to paint your own portrait, not someone else's reflection of you. And this is where I know, like, people have in call-out culture, Luigi Pirandello was in big trouble because at one point he was very pro-Mussolini, and the legend has he melted his Nobel Prize, down to help support the cause. But I think it was only a year, and it was right before he died. And you can kind of, if you look at Pirandello's background, you kind of understand why he wanted everything very clear, like, oh, the trains are going to run on time and all this. But what his theories are, which despite of, his rather unfortunate political mistake or embracing, is that his theories of mirror and mask are really fascinating and very, that especially, what are the masks you put on to survive in the world? And then how you look at your own face, you see your own face because you're mirrored back to yourself. And what and who is that mirror, right? So if you look at whole groups of people, when they start out and their identity is like mirrored back to them, things are taken away that they're able to root themselves into their real core powerful identity. And then they're mirrored back to themselves in a very productive way and in a very destructive way, and often in oppressive ways. And then they start to kind of say, oh, this is my face. So when I look at my own mirror, I'm looking at the face that has been mirrored back to me. And that's where so you have to shatter that mirror. Sometimes you have to have a mirror to look at yourself, and sometimes you have to shatter the mirrors. And I think what this time is doing is that it's shattering mirrors.
Did it for you? Did it shatter your mirror?
My mirror was already shattered. My mirror was really already shattered. I don't know that it's had such a big impact on me, except sort of saying, there it is. Oh, I was waiting for this to come. I kind of sensed that 2020 was going to be a rough year. I didn't sense that there was going to be a pandemic. But it felt to me we were heading towards something where we could no longer, the tipping point, where it wouldn't hold, where things would start to collapse, where it would be like, what do they call metal fatigue in the society. I think the pandemic has speeded that up. And in a way, the pandemic is a shattering of the mirror in terms of looking at ourselves and saying, oh, who are we? The whole Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, that's been around since the, 1619. But, what that is and what that reveals about us as individuals and what it reveals to us as a society. And so it's a very hard time. I think it's going to get harder. For me, it's not even so much our theater is going to open. It's like, will our society survive? But I can't believe that that Kentuckian senator, I'm not even going to say his name, Mitch, quoted Martin Luther King's incredible quote about the arc, of justice, and then saying, but what he did say, which I always say, is that doesn't, which Dr. King said, is that doesn't happen on its own. We have to bend it. We have to bend it. How do we bend it? And we bend it with a core of our vision, our ethics, our ideologies, our concern, our compassion, our, what we form at the center, what our core intentionalities are, the communities we gather around us that are strengthened and also challenge us, but are strengthened by us, so that there's a kind of dialogue that's going on, and that those communities can get larger and larger, and that, what keeps them together is the core, is the magnetic core of what the belief is. And if that is some sort of, radical empathy, you were talking about radical movements, radical empathy, the whole thing about like, was it radical geometry, where you find that, no matter how separate the circles are, if you track their radiuses at one point, they're all going to converge, some of them way outside of those circles, but what is the center of that circle? And if you say that is the new center of the circle, then what is the circle that embraces everyone? It's like, I love Venn diagrams. I'm a sucker for Venn diagrams, because I say, where is the sweet spot between people that don't seem to have anything in common? They will have something in common. Years ago, the mayor of Austin, whose name's also flown out of my head, but I was so inspired by him, was talking about this whole idea that what he was doing in Austin was saying, here were people who were just on extreme ends, but then he found the radical center, though I don't think he used that word, or the sweet spot, where they cared about their kids. And that's where he started from. You start from the sweet spot of what is shared, right? And I think that's what theater can do. That theater can find that sweet spot, so that people come, and they don't all react in the same ways, nor should they, but they resonate to it. And I love what's happening with science. I think physics, how physics enters in biology. So some of the things that they've discovered, like mirror neurons, when they kind of discovered mirror neurons, by accident, because they were doing experiments on monkeys, which is sort of horrible, but the scientists noticed that the brain wave, the monkey had been attached, and he noticed that the brain wave of the monkey watching him eat a nut was the same, pretty similar as the brain waves of the monkey actually eating the nut himself. So it was like the mirror neurons and empathy. And that's, if there's like a metaphor for the theater, that seems to be it. And this whole thing, that's actually a line that Matthew Glassman says, one of the performers, writers here at Double Edge, says in his piece, in 6 Feet Apart Altogether, he says, our hearts are beating at the same time. And that's the whole thing that they did this study, that in the theater, your hearts, the audience's hearts start to beat, in synchronicity, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So for me, those things are to go back to the center, to go back to the source, to go back to what is really, what brings us together, what is shared, not identically, right? But what resonates for us is what the theater can do. So the whole thing in terms of like, why do you do it? For whom do you do it? I mean, let's face it, the theater, Broadway, I can't afford to go to Broadway shows. My students can't afford to go to much theater. So who's the theater for? And what is it for? I mean, my whole interest in theater really moved much more to ensembles. Like I became very much supportive of the network of ensemble theaters and the National Performance Network, and also the National New Play Network, the smaller theaters, who might be the ones that end up surviving more because they do have, they do know what it is to scrabble closer to the ground to survive. And also I find that the why of what they're doing and why they're doing it and their sense of community tends to be stronger. It's like that Mike Daisy piece they did, How Theater Failed America, in terms of, and the Todd London books, the Ben Pesner and Todd London, book, in terms of, really looking at the landscape and what is it about and what the marketplace is.
The manifestos that he put together.
Yeah. So, and I've been very lucky in my life. I probably wouldn't have stayed at places that weren't like this, quite frankly, but I was very lucky to be at the public with Joe Papp,
How did you meet him?
Huh?
How did you meet him, Joe Papp?
I met him because I met Lynn Holst, who was the literary manager at the time, and she went off to work for American Playhouse for many years. Wonderful, wonderful dramaturg. She was the literary manager there. And we actually met because Colleen Dewhurst, who was with the producer Ken Marcellet at the time, was doing a show in Cleveland. And the former person who Lynn used to work with, Melanie Carville, who was the great actor Jack McGowan's stepdaughter, was working for Ken Marcellet. So they were going off to Cleveland at Thanksgiving, and their son Alex was off somewhere else, but their young son, Campbell, the great, wonderful actor Campbell Scott, who was about 15 or 16 at the time, was staying home at Flood Farm, it was called. And so Colleen and Ken said, well, to saying, why don't you just ask some of your friends, Melanie said to Melanie, ask some of your friends to come up for Thanksgiving and spend the weekend and keep an eye on Campbell, who's the sweetest kid ever, who had a little guest house next to the main house. So that's where I met Lynn Holst. And she was starting a wonderful series at the Public called Poets at the Public, which was during that time. There's a jazz series and a poetry series and a film series, and they had the Latino Festival. There was all this stuff going on, right, at the Public, along with the mobile unit. I was really happy when Oscar really brought back the whole, public works. In that way. I always thought it was one of the most important things the Public did. So she said, do you want to come intern in the literary office? So I said, yeah, I would love to. And that's how it started. And then I was filing play reports because at that point there were thousands of scripts, unsolicited scripts that came in every year. And and all these readers would come, actors, directors, writers would come, take the scripts away and then write little reports, half-page reports, what it was about, what was good about it. Was it someone we should pay attention to? What kind of letters should we write back, right? Should we just be polite? Should we say, not this play, but please keep in touch? Should we, maybe engage in them? So I would read all these reports as I was filing them, because I'm really a speed reader. So I go, blah, 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 and file it, and blah, 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 and file it. And then people would say, oh, what was that play? And what did the reader think about it? And I'd sort of chirp up, and, because I remembered reading it. And then Joe Papp came by once when I was there at the filing cabinet. And he said something to me, and I just kind of quipped back to him. I didn't realize you weren't supposed to, quip back to Joe, this little dog. And he got very surprised. He said, what, are you talking to me? And I said, a cat can talk to a king, from Alice. And that was like, he said, oh, you need a bath, little dog, and I'll feed you. So that's really the way it started. And Robert Blacker, who passed away very recently, who was the associate literary manager, dramaturg. He worked a lot with Des McAnuff. He was a Shakespeare dramaturg. He really mentored me. And this was really before there were dramaturgical programs. In fact, he had me read a script in front of him because I wanted to be a script reader. I loved reading plays. I was so interested in it. I'd fallen in love with Sam Shepard's work and Beckett and all these plays. I'd gone to see it wasn't the Open Theater, it was the Winter Project with Joe Chaikin and his whole group. And I was just into, all of this stuff. So he said, well, okay, read a play and we'll see what you think about it. I said, great, I'll bring it home. I'll bring in the report tomorrow. And he said, no, read it in front of me. So I read it in front of him, talking through. And then there was just this moment where he got to the second act and there was a scene, like the second scene or something in the second act. And I said, oh, it falls apart here. And he says, yes, it does. He says, so what's wrong with that scene? I said, I actually don't think anything is wrong with that scene. I think that something needed to happen in this scene in the first act in order to set up this scene. And if that happened in the first act, actually this scene would work really well. And I'll never forget, Robert looked at me and he went, wow. He said, I think you might be a dramaturg. And I'd never heard the word before. And I always joke with my students, I say, it sounded like you used a shovel and got really dirty. Then he sort of said what it was. It was about research. It was about reading. Eventually, it was about having dialogues with writers about their work, also helping to, dialogue potentially with directors and also, working in creating projects with, that all the different things that a dramaturg could do, and that all the different things that you needed to know about design. And not all dramaturgs think this way, but I do, is that you need to know about design. You need to know about staging. You need to know about the kinetics of the stage. You need to know that sometimes what's wrong is not necessarily the line, but the light cue and the level that the light is at, and that it's fading on a 7 count and not a 5 count. And that makes the difference. Right, that dramaturgy. And so I really feel that dramaturgy is something everybody participates in inside a theater project. That you all have to participate in the dramaturgy. And I think the metaphor for that in our society is that we all have to participate in the dramaturgy of our society.
Yeah. How do we dramaturg our own lives, our cities, our communities? Yeah. Our relationships,
Yeah.
It's a much bigger, as you say, it mirrors something. And I remember I was holding a dramaturgy sessions at the Segal Center, and that was one director, I think from the Mint. Others say, well, if the director is so stupid that he or she doesn't know what to do with the play and needs someone else like a dramaturg, I wouldn't hire the director. Which is shocking, it's thinking that European directors like Peter Stein, if they don't have 2 or 3 of the most significant dramaturgs, they wouldn't start working,
Right. Because their brain is fully given over to the theatricality. And let's face it, European directors tend to be more theatrical. Great theatrical directors in this country, whether you're talking about Robert Woodruff or Joanne Akalaitis, Anne Bogart kind of found a way to navigate it. But the really Peter Sellers, right, just doing, all of these great theatrical directors that really use spectacle aligned with thought, right? Because I love that. Not just spectacle, it's spectacle as a delivery system for thought as well and for emotion. But you look at the great theatrical directors in this country, They don't do well.
It's true. Yeah. Bob Wilson works with dramaturgs. One or even two is a significant.
Yeah. Because if you're going to, because you have that dialogue. You're thinking, I'm thinking the image. I'm thinking the image. I'm thinking the image. What does that image mean? You figure it out. The way Richard Foreman is with actors, like Richard Foreman works with really good actors because they take care of themselves. You know, if an actor says, Richard says, cross, this is the beat, turn your head, do this movement, this is your choreography, this is how you fit into the mechanism. The actor says, what is my motivation? Richard will say, that's not my job. That's your job. You figure it out. So, so you look at someone like David Patrick Kelly, who's a great actor, and he does these Richard Foreman works, and he knows what he's doing all the time. He has, he's activated. He has, he has an incentive. He has, he knows what his motivation is.
Yeah, and someone like Pina Bausch, who created a dance dramaturg like Reinhold, well, now does his own work, but she was the first thing, even in her work with this wordless often Tanztheater, she said how significant that is. And now we have, of course, objects on stage, the light, robots, plants and animals and all of it. Castellucci's work, highly dramaturgical, and Pier Santa Di Matteo, who works with it, and so many others. So you have been on the forefront of that. Do you feel, you said not really, but it already was smashed, that mirror of the surface, but do you feel in this time of Corona, you realize something, or you say, I'm going to devote more time to this, or that this became clearer to me? Do you feel something has happened?
I actually don't, oddly enough, because I feel it was already here. I feel a physical virus is just a manifestation, and that's very Artaud, I guess. That's what he talked about. That the physical manifestation of a disease, of a virus, of a pandemic is a manifestation of something else that's going on. Not Susan Sontag, not the psychological individual has made themselves sick, that kind of thing. But as a society, we do make ourselves, sick. And you look at it, what's the thing? It's our dealings with animals, that it could probably, started, in a wet market, how we deal with animals, all the diseases that come from animals. I mean, we haven't seen the beginning of it yet. Corona, I think that's nothing to what's coming. We really have to be prepared. We have to be prepared to support each other. We have to be prepared to, and I actually don't like the word love because people, I think, overuse it a lot. But I do like the word love because I do, the whole thing about, again, Shakespeare. Okay, Shakespeare. Here's going back to Shakespeare. He puts, I think, one of the best definitions of love into the mouth of essentially a 13-year-old girl, where Juliet says, my bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love as deep. The more I give, the more I have, for both are infinite. And I remember reading Sylvie and Bruno, which is a Lewis Carroll book that's about these two kids that are looking for their father, and they go through fairyland. But there's a really moment at the beginning. Sylvie's father gives her a locket, and on one side it's blue, and on the other side it's red. And on the blue side it says Sylvie will be loved, and on the red side it says Sylvie will love, and she has to make a choice. Well, there's two lockets, actually. There's two lockets. Sorry, I just messed it up. There's two lockets, and she has to make a choice between them. And I remember reading it as a kid going, well, I really like the color blue, but I love that idea of the red, that she will love. Somehow that felt more important to me, right? That being loved is like, but loving is like, Juliet, ooh, loving, right? So she chooses the red one. And then when she finds her father or whatever, she says, look at your locket. And she looks at the locket and it's blue. She said, wait, I have the wrong one. And she turns it over and she has both lockets. And I always was so impressed as a little girl by that philosophy and that core, again, that core idea, that center of gravity. And I think we have to find that in ourselves and what that means. that to care, and love is attention. Like love is your willingness to give attention, unequivocal attention to something, whether it's your work, whether it's a person, you know, your favorite anything, your attention, that it is a gravitational pull for your attention. And the more that that's shared, I think the stronger society comes, and people in power and oppressive regimes and people who are miserable and people who have, like I tell my students in the Sanskrit notion of unstable pride. I think practically everything that's wrong with you people can be driven to unstable pride, whether it's greed or vanity or braggadociousness. If your pride and you know is stable just with nothing, just who you are. I once said to Joe when he said, "Don't you know who I am?" I said, "Well, Mr. Pap, I think you are who you are when you're naked in the desert alone in front of your God." I can't believe I said to him. I was about 23. And he basically looked at me and said, "Get out of my office." And I went out of the office and everyone's there thinking, "My God, Morgan's being yelled at." And I went, "I'm not fired." And they kept saying to me, I said, "Well, what if he fires? What if he's had enough of you one day and fires you?" And I said, "Well, if he fires me for that, why would I want to work for him?"
Mm-hmm. That's
right?
true.
Right. So, and I think because I never had any sense of security at all, ever since I was a very, very little girl, I never expected it. And I think the expectations we have is what does us in. But it's exciting seeing the how and what people are doing. Can I talk about that a little bit? Where are we at?
Yeah, we want to get closer. Maybe just one or two thoughts. So what would a Joe Pap do? Do you have a feeling what he would be in this crisis? What would be your guess?
Oh, he'd probably be organizing a testing site and having drives to give people, you know, the requirements they need, you know, and having, you know, sending theater into neighborhoods on the mobile unit. He'd probably revive the mobile unit and find some way to socially distance, you know, going back to the actual mobile units on the truck, even maybe going back to the, you know, to the pageant wagons where you see a scene, you gather, you know, in a place and, you know, keep distance from each other and have your mask. And then the first scene of the first act would come by, and then maybe the actors would, you know, then the second scene or whatever of some sort of thing. He'd find a way, probably go back into the East Side Amphitheater. He'd find a way to make the park work, probably. Yeah. He'd find a way to make the park work. But he'd, you know, he'd have a testing, he'd make the public theater a testing site. That I have no doubt. And he'd be what the public theater is doing or was doing. They were a haven for the demonstrators. It was wonderful. You know, there are aspects of Oscar that resonate with what Joe and that aspect of deciding. There are aspects that definitely don't. But there are aspects that do, and that deciding, you know, the decision of the public and their fabulous staff to have the lobby open and to give water and to have the bathrooms open, you know, and to have, like, if you needed to come and, you know, be in the lobby and, you know, you could come do that. And several theaters did that. New York Theater Workshop did that. The Flea did that. Several other theaters. Yeah. So I think that's what he would do. And he would be gung-ho about all these things that are happening, like up here at Double Edge. So that's, 6 feet apart all together.
Not a little bit. It's not 6 feet under, luckily. It's 6 feet.
No, it's not 6 feet under, not yet.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit. I mean, you also, you know, as far as I know, you know so many things and in contact also across the country, you know. Tell us a bit what's going on. What do you think? This is of interest. This is something we should know about.
Well, there are Pittsfield, Massachusetts seems to be the hub right now. And Massachusetts it was a really interesting process in terms of, yes, you can do theater, but these are the parameters. This is what you have to do. This is how you have to handle the bathrooms, which is probably the trickiest situation. You have to have exit and flow for the audience, as well as being 6 feet apart and masked. So the Berkshire Theater Company is doing live theater. At Barrington Stage is doing live theater, and they're both in Pittsfield or around Pittsfield. Let me just, the Berkshire Theater Group, Kate McGuire is the artistic director there. So they have an indoor theater, but they're not using that. They're putting a tent, Colonial Theater. They have a tent there, and starting in August, they're going to do one of the first equity approved things, which is Godspell. They're going to do a production of Godspell. And so they figured out a way to do that. Barrington Stage, also Julie Boyd there. They're doing like David Cale's wonderful piece, a solo piece that another actor, Mark Dold, is doing, Henry Clark. So they're doing that. They have a whole cycle of performances also. So does Berkshire Theater Group. And they figured out like one, I forget which one, like their seating capacity is usually 500, but now it's going to be 185. Bread and Puppet, Peter Schumann, that do their huge things that they have. They're trying to figure out a way to continue that they're doing it. Maybe 150 or so people can be there in terms. Yeah, and if you're outside, it's much easier if you're in a tent. But Ubuntu in Oakland, so the Oakland Theater Project is doing Wasteland with this solo show. Lisa Ramirez, who's a wonderful playwright and actress and dramaturg too, is performing that. And that's going to be drive-in theater. So there's like drive-in movies that are happening, but they're basically going to be in the parking lot of the theater. And you have like a radio feed, but you can watch and hear that way. So the drive-in theater, that's happening. The theater in El Paso, I think it's called Theater Across Borders. And that takes people on a hike, 10 people at a time, where there's kind of theatricality. So in some ways that the aspects of what Double Edge is doing, because when Double Edge, it's 3 groups that go, it's like Irene Fornes, right? It's like Fefu. You go to see, different pieces in different orders, but you see all of them, and your base is like 30, 35 people or so come, and they're split into groups of like maybe 10 to 12, which keeps that social distancing. And the actors are distanced from each other as well. Mostly. I mean, we've now been pretty much quarantined together. I'm also performing in it. Yeah. Again, singing, which is very exciting for me, not having been able to.
You also did for Taylor Max, right? You were
I was. That's right. I was in Taylor Max 24-hour. I was a dandy minion in his 24-hour concert. And I'm working still. Taylor Max seems to always work on 5 projects at a time. He's working on a musical kind of look at Socrates' last hour after he's taken the hemlock, which is called The Hang, which is us hanging with him, in his last hour. And he's working with Matt Ray, his fabulous composer and music director. That we're kind of collaborating. So it's going to be sort of a music jazz piece. But again, what makes it, and what I love about Taylor, is that Taylor really starts from the why, what is it, what for, who is it for, why are we doing this, what's the exploration. So his whole thing is like, well, why do you want to do this? He says, the whole question of how can you be moral in an immoral world, right? So that's the center of gravity. And again, the mirror of how we look at the questions that we're having. And depending on COVID, this was something that actually here, Kristen Marting at Here had commissioned Gary originally before it kind of became this big commercial production. So this is the piece that he's going to do at Here to replace that commission. I'm very excited about it. So how it's going to be done? How is the question, right? Want to do it. So how is it going to be done? How do you have, hey, maybe you don't want to get close to Socrates. You don't want to get close to each other. You're in disguise. Maybe your masks are masks that you're disguising yourself from being recognized at being at Socrates's. Hey, there's all kinds of like, how do you,
Right.
how do you solve, the issue? How do you make it's the I Ching. It's like obstacles, great obstacles are great opportunity.
Or like in your
as long as you're healthy and not on the street and not a refugee, and as long as you're like one of the lucky ones. And I think Carl touched on this a little bit when he was saying that it was sort of really making him think deeply and whatever. But I do think for those who have, Carl Hancock Rux, who I introduced, Melanie Joseph had introduced him to me when I was at the Public, and had started what was then going to turn into Joe's Pub. It was kind of a little festival. We made a Joe's Pub on the stage of the Newman Theater. And she said, you have to meet this guy, Carl Hancock Rux. So that was the first time I met him. And I'll never forget, I went, Carl Hancock Rux! It was such a great name to introduce. It was just extraordinary. But
deeply moving and thoughtful what he said.
Oh, brilliant, and deeply moving, deeply feeling, and wonderful writer. But what he said, also is that those of us who have the luxury to do this, to not worry about we're going to be evicted in 2 minutes, and we do have food to eat, and we're not worrying about our children, and we're not sick. It's a luxury, and it's also an obligation. We have an obligation to ask these questions of ourselves, I think we have an obligation.
Yeah, and we have to
change. And to be inventive. Huh?
He said, what would all those people have died for if we don't?
Exactly.
From it, it's
exactly. We few, we happy few, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not so happy, but
well, it's good to hear from you. It reminds me of that old, I think it's the Polish definition of optimism and pessimism. The pessimist says things cannot possibly get any worse, and the optimist says yes, they can.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that.
The time to be a resilient optimist, say, yes, actually, this can get worse, and we haven't seen it, and we have to react. So listen, we could talk for much more time, and also get an update from you, maybe whatever, 3 months, half a year. We'll see how things are coming up. Anything you still want to share on the screen, or something?
No, I would, this piece at Double Edge is phenomenal. I think it's inspirational. Unfortunately, it's beyond sold out. But I think, to go to the website, see some of the articles, and also just check out, some of the things that people are starting to do around the country in terms of being inspired. Also Great Small Works, which is a puppet company that the political puppet company I'm involved with, that started during Occupy's kind of been umbrellaed by, does these puppet slams. There's one coming up, a spaghetti dinner in August that's coming up, and that's both live puppet shows of people doing live puppet shows and also recorded puppet shows. So that's a whole, we never know what's going to happen at any given time, but that's kind of, again, the community. And so it's an outlet for everyone, but it's also the building of community. The Labyrinth, the theater company Labyrinth, that did a reading, several weeks ago. It was just a Zoom reading, but it was so moving, just to have them read with each other and have that community. So I think even the Zoom readings, A Brave New World did, like a different act of Hamlet with different directors and company members from all over the world, one act a week. Which was really fun. LaMama's doing things from their series, the Public, Joe's Pub. A lot of things are happening.
Lots of things are happening. So it's good. It's good to hear from you. It's good to get the update, and it's important to keep in mind really what you said, and for everybody who's working in the arts, but also in our lives, you know, that this is a physical manifestation of something that has been wrong, that has infected us, and maybe as a way to see how do we get through this, and that distancing perhaps is something that will have to bring us closer together.
Yeah.
Something that was missing before. And yeah, so tomorrow we have with us Helen Minardi from Indonesia, who's going to talk about her work in Indonesia, and also she's putting together groups like you of artists and how to support, how to stay connected in the world. We're going to hear from Lebanon, from Dima Mata. It's a tough time in Beirut. It's collapsing. After the hard time in civil war, there's kind of opening, and right now it seems to be one of the places, as you say, you know, where we have not seen what is really happening in that world. And on Friday, Richard Schachner will be with us and give us his view of the world, and talk a bit about also his journal, which he is putting together, a COVID thing, where he has really
good
writers from around the world, what they do think about. So really, Morgan, it was great to have you with us. It is important.
Thank you.
It's so important what you have done, and it's also important what you are going to do. And yeah, and it's shocking to hear that someone like you who teaches at Columbia University says, I can't afford to go to see a Broadway show I want to see. It's just shocking. It shows what is really wrong.
Adjunct professors, although Columbia is better than most.
That is true, yeah. But still, in general, I mean, we have music colleagues who say it's tough to find, you know, the way to go to the concerts they would like to see. So something is really wrong. The access to the arts, the access to health, the access to education, and things have to change. And I hope we are a little bit part of that change, as you said, to create a community. And just by observing, I think Anne Bogart said that, quoting a physicist, you observe something, you notice. Maybe something also changes, and but it is a call to action. And as you said before, it is us. We have to be part of the change and be the change if we want to see it. And
the touch bases that you do with all these people, and what I love so much, especially Frank, is that it is international, as international as it is, because we tend to get really, really provincial in this country, you know, and to hear from all these other artists from these other countries, from what's going on and the other perspectives, and to really broaden our view of the world and ourselves is really, really important. And to have the consistency of that's been wonderful.
And hopefully symbolically it stands for something bigger, that there is a listening to the world also here in America, in New York, and that we have to take into account. So really, thank you. Thanks for HowlRound.
Yes, that records them, so I can see all the ones I missed.
And as thanks to our listeners, it's as you say, it's a lot out there. It means a lot to us that you take the time, that you listen to the artists. What they have to say is significant. First, also, they need to know that people are interested, and we have to support them. But also, what they have to say might change something, contribute an authentic change. What Morgan said, what Carl said, what Oncia said, what Schachner, so many said, it can help us to maybe redefine the dramaturgy of our own lives. And thanks to the Segal team, Andy and Sun Yang, and I hope you will be able to.
Can I just sneak one more in for those of you around Chatham, New York? There's a fabulous performance space called PS21, which is performance space for the 21st century, that's starting to do in their band shell, socially distant, mainly concerts, but that also have all kinds of plans for kind of little like walking tours and more theatrical events coming into the fall. So they're also being very creative about approaching this.
21, you heard it first here. I was not aware. Fantastic.
Yeah, heard it first here.
And, all the best for the double-edged work for the opening.
Thank you.
Come and see it. And as Peter Schumann, it says tribes, and they're perhaps working in nature. Having your own space seems what's working, what has always worked. Gene Barba talked about it too. Maybe this is a way to really think. That is a way to do theater and to do the theater you want in a community you create and be part of the community you're in. So thank you so much. And Morgan,
thank you, Frank. Thanks for asking.